Selamat datang dan terima kasih sebab nangga video kami tu. Hello everyone, my name is Golda Mowe. I'm a writer from Sarawak. I wrote the Iban Dream series. These are stories about Iban headhunters. And I've also written 4 other books. Now, like the first 3 books, these 2 books were also published outside of Sarawak. The Laughing Monster is about a modern Iban boy. And my story actually was one of the finalists for the Scholastic Asian Book Award in 2016. And I've also written a science fiction story, short stories, as a project collaboration with a publisher in Kuala Lumpur. However, these 2 are the ones that I published in Sarawak. These 2 books are based in Cebu, contemporary Cebu. One is an anthology of 10 short stories. That the ideas came from, all those folk stories or ghost stories that my mother and grandmother used to tell me. And one is actually based on my own experience when I was in Kuching. And then this is a short novella that is based in Cebu. Now the sleuth, it's a detective story actually. The sleuth for this story is Ini Andan. She is the Iban shaman goddess and goddess of justice. So when she found out that her friend's son had been murdered, she persuades the other spirits to help her expose the murderer. So these are the books that I've published. Now, there are some other works that I am considering to publish in Sarawak itself, but right now I'm putting it on hold because of the COVID situation. I was hoping that it would have lasted for about 3 or 4 months when I first published these 2 books. But now it's been more than a year, and books are really difficult to promote and sell when you don't go to festivals, because festivals are the best place to sell any kind of new ideas. So without public festivals, there's not much I can do. So I'll have to wait before I publish the other work. And right now, I've just finished editing a new book with Random House Southeast Asia in Singapore. The edit was finished somewhere in last month, so I'm hoping to see that new title maybe by the end of the year or early next year. Yeah, that's the latest one. Why did I start publishing these books? Actually, when I first started writing, I've only intended to do 1 book. Because I didn't feel like I have enough knowledge about my own culture to write a whole series of books. For one thing, I grew up in town. I didn't grow up in the longhouse. I do visit my grandparents in the longhouse during the school holidays and all that. And for me, that is like visiting a foreign country because it was so different from life in town. I mean, for one thing, for life in town, you're cooped up in the house with your own family. But when you're in a long house, everybody is family, You're like running from one end to the other, and everyone will be feeding you. So it was a lot of fun, and it was so different. So I became curious about life in the longhouse. And the other problem that I had, apart from being separated from life in the longhouse, was that I was a sickly child, in the sense like I had a lot of allergies. So my grandparents were superstitious. So there were a lot of things that they didn't try to show me at first, They tried to hide from me. And maybe because of that, I became very obsessed with stories, because stories were the only way that I can understand my culture. I mean, they did want to teach me to weave. They don't want me to go to the farm and all that, because usually when I go or when I do these things, I'll become sick, you see. I suspect it's just because of allergies. But for them, because they were superstitious, they just thought that maybe my semangat was weak. So they tried to hide that part of the culture from me. However, I was a very curious child. in the sense like I was not afraid of things that most normal children were afraid of. For example, if you tell me stories about monsters, I'll be curious to try to find those monsters, you see. So when I started to explore the longhouse and my grandparents' fruit orchard on my own, my grandparents of course got worried because there are animals all over the place. I mean, you have snakes, you have like those sun bears, they call jugams, you know, around. So they're always worried about me, and my grandparents would try to scare me by telling me, you know, these monsters will eat you, that monster will kidnap you, and that only excited me more, you see, because it's like, wow, they are talking animals, you know. So I'm always like going around in the bushes trying to find talking animals and stuff. So so then my grandmother came up with the idea of making me read Iban literature. For me, that was my saving grace, in the sense like in the 70s and 80s, we were not taught the Iban language formally in schools. So I actually learned to read Iban literature through my grandmother, because she found out that the only way she can make me stay at home in the afternoon, you know, instead of wandering off on my own, is to make me read an Iban book for her. And she was usually very strict and a very, you know, aggressive woman. But every time when I start reading the book to her, she would patiently explain everything that's going on. Like, there were a lot of words I didn't recognize, and I'll ask her. There were a lot of customs I didn't recognize, and I'll ask her. And she was very, very patient about it, and she would teach me and help me along. So that helped me love Iban folklore stories, because the thing is, the English version of Iban folklore stories that we see in books, the English or the Malay version, they are very simplified, you know. They are very simple, like fairy tales for children. But the ones that are written in these books of literature, they are written in Iban, but they're sophisticated, they're complicated, you know. There's a lot of interesting contents, a lot of interesting human dynamics inside there. So I grew up thinking that everybody knew this about the Ibans, and when I started schooling outside of Cebu, I began to realize that very few people know the stories of Keling and Kumang, or about our warpath god Senggalang Burong. Nobody was aware of them, actually. So around that time, I started to have this idea that maybe I should, you know, write stories in English about them, because there are a lot of books in Iban out there, and we as an Iban community already know that our culture is very rich, but the rest of the world doesn't. You know, even people who, even my friends who are living in Cebu doesn't know about that. So I came up with the idea of Iban Dream, thinking that this would be the only book that I would write. And the reason is because I don't feel like I know enough about the Iban culture to write more books. But it ended up that I wrote 3 novels. I ended up writing Iban Journey and Iban Woman, you know, and also a story about a modern Iban boy for the laughing monster. So for those of you who feel like you don't know enough about your own culture, it's okay. Just start from somewhere, because after a while the memories will start to come back, the feelings will start to come back, and then as you explore your story more, you will begin to suddenly think about, oh, why did my grandmother do that? You know, why did my grandfather do that? The most important thing to writing stories is asking the right questions. So if you are familiar with your culture, you know, even though you you don't know the answers to everything, but at least you know what questions to ask, and that's very important. And this is especially important if your culture has very little literature apart from your own native language. For example, like the Ibans, we have quite a number of Iban books out in the market, mostly self-published, but then most of the other texts on the Ibans are in English. Are non-fiction. Most of them are non-fiction, and most of them are told from the viewpoint and through the value lenses of a foreigner. So then their own motivations come in. For example, like if you think that Ibans are like ruthless headhunters, then you will be going out and looking for evidences that Ibans are ruthless headhunters, And for me, growing up, that was a strange thing. That idea was actually quite strange because every time when I visit the Longhouse in the 70s, yes, I would see, human skulls, but they're very old, And then, yes, there will be some famous Iban headhunters in my Longhouse, but they were like 2 or 3 generations ago. And it's not like every family has one. No, it's like, it could be that one Longhouse could have 2 or 3, And that's all, that's it, you see. So how can you say that all Ibans are ruthless headhunters? So when I was thinking about this and I was going through all these things, I began to realize that the reason the world thinks we are is because we as a people lost control of our own culture. Somebody else took over because they think that our culture is interesting, it's adventurous in the sense like, this is like the perfect place for adventurers to come in. You have all those romanticized stories of James Brooke and how he come into Sarawak and all that. So people just, caught on to that imagination, and then they tried to build a culture that fits with what they think is that romanticized version of the Ibans. And we lost control of that because we do not have somebody who comes in and say, look, this is what we are, you see. So I would like everyone in Sarawak who feels like they want to write or they have a story to write. It does not matter. It could be futuristic, it could be modern, it could be historical, it could be fantasy or folklore. I really encourage you to start writing because you need to take control back. You need to control the narrative of your own culture, because if you don't do that, if you don't define your own culture, somebody will define it for you. Don't let somebody change the story for you. Make sure that you have that story. For example, like last year, 2 years ago, there was one student, an Iban girl who studied in Korea, who came to visit me. And she interviewed me about my book, Iban Woman. And she was talking about women's rights in the Iban society, about how do women deal with being put down by men and all that. And I just couldn't answer her question, And after a while, I asked her, you're Iban, right? She said, yeah. And who is the boss in your family? And she thought about it. She thought, my mother. And who is the boss for all of your families, for all of your cousins and all that? And she thought about it a bit, and she said, my grandmother. And I said, so why do you think that we have issues with women's rights in our community? You see, because our community is made up of strong women. I think part of it is because in the olden days, men used to travel, so women were in charge of the Longhouse, and they were also in charge of the rice fields, because only women can plant the paddy seeds in the past. So because of that, women in the Iban community tend to be stronger, and more aggressive. Of course, once they've moved out of the longhouse, I mean, things start to change because they have to adapt to modern society. And I think one of the sad things about modernization is that our women, our younger generation of women became more timid, you know. But originally they were not, because as far as I can remember, even in my own household, my grandmother was the boss, and even in my cousin's household, their mothers were the boss. So I couldn't really think about why she would come up with the idea that that Iban women were inferior to men. So of course when I asked her about it, and she just said that, well, that's what most Asian societies are like, you know. But then I reminded her that we're not like most people, you see. So these are the kind of narratives that you must try to bring back. You know, there are a lot of wonderful things about your own community, you know, about your own race that you can introduce to the outside world. Maybe a new idea, you know, a new life philosophy, because the world is still struggling with a lot of other issues, like in this case, women's rights, children's rights. You know, for example, like abuse of children. In the olden days, for the Ibans, it is taboo to hit a child, because they believe that if you hit the child, you will break their spirit, you know, make their spirit weaker. So for the Ibans, they believe that if the spirit is weak, then you are prone to sickness. And sickness, of course, will lead to death. So these are some of the philosophies that I could, you know, easily teach to the world, because this is how my family have grown up. I mean, for those of you who wonder why Iban children are so naughty and so rude, well, that's the reason, because we aren't allowed to discipline them too much. You know, culturally, we can't discipline them too much. But of course, nowadays, you do hear stories of abuse, because a lot of Ibans have moved away from the old taboos, you know. But luckily, most families still maintain the cultural behavior that came out from the old ideas. Don't think that just because you live in a small village or a small town, you don't have a story to tell. You do have a story to tell, you know, because if you look at some of the foreign novels on ghosts or on mystery, a lot of it are based in small towns. I think the reason it's based in small towns is because small towns tend to have a lot of mysterious places. You know, like people are usually either very gossipy or they're very secretive. So you can use that to your advantage to create your story. So don't think like you're living in a small town or you're living in a small village so you don't have a story to tell. No, there is no such thing. I mean, there are lots of stories to tell in these kind of places because it's so mysterious. Okay, and I really recommend that you just start somewhere. Start from a special place, you know, a place where maybe where you and your friends used to play a lot in. You know, why do you play there in the first place? I mean, start with that, you know, explore, play. You don't have to print everything that you write down, but you need to start, because that will get the juices flowing. It's like opening a tap, you know. If you don't open the tap, no water is going to come out. So you open the tap, let the water run out, and see which part you want to keep and which part you want to expand on or do research, more research in. I mean, I've written a lot of stories just based on life here in Sarawak. I mean, let me introduce one short story to you. Okay, this one is written about a medical dresser in a kampong, in a longhouse. You see, there are so many things you can do with this kind of stories. Okay, so this is from my book of short stories, Encounters. It's a modern day story, right? Medical dresser's house call. Another slow day at the clinic. There were a steady number of patients who came in, but most of them were only there for a chat. Robert sent them off with a bit of paracetamol and reminded them to only take those pills when they were feeling ill. 2 children had actual fevers, but nothing serious. This was the first time that a clinic had been set up in this longhouse village, so it was a novelty for the children and elderly to visit. Robert did not mind them because it kept him busy. But the evenings were lonely though. He was always welcome in the longhouse, but being a medical dresser, all anybody wanted to talk about was their aches and pains. So on days like these, when he felt that he had had enough of dispensing medical advice that nobody was going to follow, he planned to return directly to his quarters behind the clinic. He hoped that the satellite signal would be clear that night because he had missed speaking with his fiancée the night before. He tapped the calendar on the wall behind his desk. That week he was scheduled to visit a rural boarding school about 3 miles upriver. It was something he always looked forward to because it broke the monotony of his schedule. Just as he switched on the porch light and was about to turn off the lights inside the clinic, the front door opened. The longhouse chief, Tuai Gelong, called out from the doorway. "Dresser Robert," the old man said, "this man here is looking for the old Manang." Robert's ears immediately perked up. He was sent to this village not only to help the people medically, but also to persuade them to trust in modern medicine. He squared his shoulders to steel himself for a lecture on how chants and songs cannot heal anyone of disease. But when 2 men stepped into the clinic behind the chief, Robert saw that they were not wearing a single stitch of modern clothing on them. Their loincloth was made of bark, and their long hair was tied back on itself into a knot at the base of their neck. Their skin was rough and appeared to be covered in ringworm. Neither man was carrying a traveling bag or a spear or even a machete. The older man said, "Tuai Gelong here was kind enough to tell us that the Manang had passed away, and he said that you are the new healer. He said your medicine is better." Robert said, "Yes, I am a trained medical dresser. The government sent me here to take care of the people." The 2 men looked at each other anxiously. Tuai Gelong said, "Don't worry, he is very good. He has new medicine from the government that can cure anything. He will write down your names and give you the medicine you need." The older man said, "I am Jagu, and this is my son Ngua. Can you give us some medicine?" Robert smiled and shook his head a little. "Different sickness will need different medicine. I must check you first and find out what is making you unwell. Then I will give you the right medicine that will cure you." Ngua said, "But it is my sister who is ill. Has she come with you?" "No, she is too sick to travel." Jagu added, "We think she has been enchanted by a demon. She is raving in her sleep." Robert made a quick guess of what their problem might be. When he first came to the village, a few children had caught malaria and they were raving with fever. The people believed that they had been possessed because these children were always playing together. Robert managed to persuade them to send the children to the nearest hospital. He suspected that Ngua's sisters could be suffering from the same problem. He must be quick. "Is she far from here?" he asked, as he pulled out a bulky, watertight plastic container from inside a low shelf. He began filling it with saline bags and a standard medical kit meant for tropical fevers. There was enough of each medication that would last for 2 days. Jagut said, "The boat ride is as long as cooking a small pot of rice. Then we have to go through the tunnel for a bit, less time than boiling water." About half an hour, Robert calculated in his head. Definitely less than 1 hour, even if he were having trouble traversing the tunnel. He planned to stay the night because it usually took a while to persuade the family to send their loved one to the nearest hospital. He excused himself and ran back to his quarters. After changing out of his white uniform into denim slacks and long-sleeved shirt, he stuffed a change of clothing into a waterproof bag. Then he rushed back to the clinic and followed the men back to their boat. The vessel looked as primitive as its owners. Ngua put the plastic box on the shallow draft boat and Robert gingerly got on to sit behind it. He expected the water to spill over the low gunwale at any moment, but the boat floated well on the water. Once they started rowing into the middle of the stream, Robert began to worry about crocodiles because this river was notorious for them. The moon was soon hidden behind some clouds, and Robert began to silently cheat himself for not bringing a torchlight with him. He had assumed that these men would have some form of light, but they apparently did not. It was surreal to be floating in pitch dark. His heart began to pound with worry, and he could feel his face growing warm with anxiety. There was a splash coming from the bank on his left, and he cringed, expecting to be overturned at any moment. He held his breath in anticipation for so long that he panted when he remembered to breathe again. After what seemed like eternity to him, the boat slowed and he felt it bump against a piece of wood. There was a splash and he felt his bag being pulled off his shoulder. He reached down, expecting to feel wood, but all he felt was water. Ngoa said, "This stream comes from the tunnel. We have to walk up it a bit, then we will get to the tunnel." Robert's breath caught in his throat. Jagu said, "I will walk in front of you. Just follow me. Ngoa will follow us from behind. Don't worry. You are safe." Robert stepped into the stream and he felt his boots sink a few inches into the alluvial mud. Then the water seeped into his boots, soaking his socks. He heard a low guttural sound come from his right and he froze. Then he heard a similar tone in front of him. There was a loud splash. Ngoa said, "It is safe to go forward now." Robert swallowed the breath stuck in his throat. He had no other choice. He could not argue with the men because it might be construed as him putting a curse on their journey. Gingerly he moved forward as advised. After wading a few yards into the tunnel, Robert suddenly realized that he could see his surroundings. He stared with wonder at the wall, which was giving off a soft grey light. Ngoa explained, "Glowworms. This is their season, so you can see them." Robert said, "I wish I had brought my phone with me. Nobody would believe this unless I took a picture." Jagut said, "Sometimes it is best to keep some things secret." "Yes, you are right," Robert said. "Modern people are usually so excited about beauty that they often ruin them." Robert was so engrossed with his surroundings he did not notice that Jagu had silently dived underwater. Suddenly, he stepped into nothingness and fell forward, face down into the water. A pair of strong hands grabbed his arms and pulled him down deeper. Robert struggled, trying his best not to swallow water. His lungs began to burn and he struggled harder to free his arms, but the hands were too strong for him. His head throbbed, and all he could hear was the sound of his desperate heartbeat. Then his feet touched land, and he renewed his struggle to swim up for air. The moment his head popped out of water, he heaved in breath after breath, sputtering and coughing in between. Then he vomited. He felt himself being dragged up a muddy bank. There was a ringing in his ears, and the light of burning torches hurt his eyes. He had to squeeze his eyes a few times to clear his vision. This is actually a modern version of old folklores. You can do the same thing with your stories. I mean, if you have this kind of stories in your culture, you can also write something like this. As you may guess, Robert, the medical dresser, was invited by humanoid crocodiles to their village to try and cure their sister. In Iban folklore, there are actually quite a few stories of manangs who would visit these places, and then when they come out, they will get gifts from the crocodile spirits. You know, gifts that will keep their family safe from crocodiles for many generations, for example, or songs that will help them, trap crocodiles in the future. You know, these are the kind of songs they can pass down to their children. So this is one story based on that folklore. I mean, that is also something that you can do, you know. And the reason that we can have we can have people accept this kind of stories nowadays, I believe, is because of social media. Social media has been so important for. Right. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, now I believe that nowadays people are more accepting of foreign stories. Accepting in the sense like they're curious and they want to buy these stories. I suspect this trend occur because of social media. I mean, if you go, for example, to Facebook, you will see a lot of posts about people going back to their villages, people trying on indigenous costumes and all that. So that helps build curiosity about new cultures. So I feel like if you do write books that are culturally based, there is a market out there already. I mean, I've sold quite a number of these books. I mean, I've had a lot of questions about them. I've had students come up and asking me all kinds of questions. So people are curious, and also it's nice for people who live overseas, because then when someone asks them about their culture, they have a point, they have a place where they can refer these people to. Like, for example, these are some of the storybooks that have come out. I mean, it's very easy to share information nowadays, and most people who are on social media do want to stand out as somebody who is, say, culturally knowledgeable or culturally sophisticated. So I feel like this is a good time, to try to publish these books. And of course, the other thing you must remember about culture is that it is not something that you only wear, you only taste, you only hear, or you only see. You see, culture is also something. It's the way that you think and the way that you feel. And I feel and I believe that stories are important for that area of culture, the thinking and the feeling, like your philosophy, like your laws, your customs, your stories. All of those are very important, because a lot of Iban youngsters who live overseas, they don't dress like Ibans. They can't eat like Ibans because the food choices, because the normal food choices that they have in their longhouse is not available where they are staying. So they dress modern, they eat modern food. So the only thing that maybe they can keep as part of their culture is a book like this. I mean, I've had a lot of Ibans from Johor who contact me, who said that they got my book. So that is a wonderful feeling. In fact, when I first wrote this, I planned for it for non-Ibans. That's why there's a lot of details and description about why Ibans do this and that, you see. But it turned out that a large majority of my readers were Iban youths, because it made them feel nostalgic, and it also keep a part of their culture with them, something that they can put on the shelf. They don't have to wait until they come home for the holidays to experience their Iban culture. They can experience it anytime they want, by picking up the book. So, so then, how easy is it to publish? Okay, now for me, I use trade publishing in the beginning because I don't understand the supply chain for marketing books. So what I do is I approach trade publishers, meaning that publishers who make a contract with writers to market, to sell, to design their books. So I approached trade publishers for my earlier books because I wanted my books to go out internationally, you see. So that one, the process was long and hard, but the long and hard part is for finishing the book, because you have to write for an international market, and when you do, you must write it in a format that international readers can understand. So it took me a few years to learn how to write in that format. I Originally I thought that just being good in English is enough, but it's not. It's not like writing a letter or an essay. It's nothing like that at all. For one thing, you need to be able to show the beauty of your culture, and beauty needs more than grammar and syntax. Beauty needs a lot of emotional and mental involvement, and it must show in your writing, or else it's very difficult to express it. So these are some of the things that I need to learn. And for the books that I publish outside of Sarawak, I do use a lot of description and details. But then I also wrote stories that I know will not make sense outside of Sarawak. In the sense, like, if you do not live in Sarawak, if you do not understand our culture here, then you will have trouble trying to understand what I'm trying to say. For example, like the role of the medical dresser in the longhouse. I mean, everyone in Sarawak understands it. For example, like he does not just take care of the people, he have to educate them, he have to understand them culturally, he has to understand, he has to know them personally. He cannot just, for example, like have a 9-to-5 job where he just work in the clinic and then when he goes home he forgets everyone and everything. He can't have that. He must have a very strong relationship with the people in the kampong or in the longhouse, and we understand that, by being in Sarawak. But people who are outside of Sarawak might have some problems. So it is this kind of stories which I find difficult to describe or to explain. So what I did with these stories was I self-published them, in the sense like I create a publishing company for myself, and then I publish it in Sarawak. Now, the thing that encouraged me to start doing this was because of the program that Pustaka has. I mean, firstly, they provide ISBN numbers for free. Now, if you look at other countries, you have to pay a small amount, a certain amount of money for getting the ISBN number. But here in Sarawak, you can apply for it through the Pustaka website for free, and it's very simple to apply. I mean, all I did was scan my IC, and in my case, because it was a business, I scanned my business permit in order. I applied to register with Pustaka as a business. You can also apply as an individual, just scan your IC and upload it into their website, and then you can start applying for ISBN numbers. It's so simple and it's free. As long as you have internet access, you can do it, you see. And then in Cebu here, there was also a printer. Because Iban writers in Sarawak had been self-publishing for 2-3 generations already. I mean, since the 50s. So there are quite a few good press publishers in Sarawak, and I'm quite satisfied with the quality. Of course, you can't have this kind of paper, this yellowish kind of paper. I mean, because these papers are so expensive, you see. So if you're okay with normal papers, then yeah, there are quite a number of very good publishers here. I mean, printers here in Sarawak. So you just get your book printed with them, put on the ISBN number, and then you send 3 copies as part of your legal deposit to the State Depository Unit, I believe. This is part of the Sarawak State Library Ordinance. I mean, it is a legal requirement. Okay. Now, some people may think like, oh, so leceh, and why do I need to do that? And what I tell them is, why not? I mean, don't think of it as a cost. I think it's fantastic that somebody wants to archive your work for you, because when they keep it in their, when you send this in as a legal deposit and they keep it in their archive, it means like researchers from outside Sarawak, when they're looking for materials about Sarawak, they will come across your book. Yeah? And then your book is also guaranteed to be kept for future generations. So it's not like something that disappears after you stop printing your stories. You know, it is something that will continue because you've deposited it with the library. So I really encourage you to do it. Please do take advantage of the friendly self-publishing atmosphere that we have in Sarawak here, because there are very few places in the world that does this. You know, so I think that's all I have for today. So I really hope that I really hope that I'll see more stories in a language that I can read. You know, I can read in Malay and Iban and English. So I'm always looking out for these three books, for these three type of mainstream language books that I can add to my own library collections. So start writing, keep writing, and help us stock our shelves here in Sarawak. Thank you so much.